So welcome back to the next chapter in this course, all about conditional logic and understanding what conditional logic is and honestly how we should expect JavaScript to behave. Now, JavaScript is an interesting language because many of the components that build up the language in fact evaluate to either true or false when we pass it through some particular expression or we try and evaluate it to what we call a Boolean, which we'll also learn about as we continue. Now, conditional logic lives pretty much everywhere in everything we do. We always make decisions. If this happens, do this. Otherwise, I'm going to do this. And the same techniques and thinking principles apply in our JavaScript and any programming language as well. Now, conditional logic doesn't just apply to JavaScript. Here we are thinking about programming concepts in general and how they can apply to JavaScript. Now, before we actually continue and start talking about if statements and else statements and real conditional logic, we need to consider what JavaScript has built in and how those particular expressions may evaluate to give us what we would call either a Truthy or a Falsy value. Now, it's not strictly true or false, but it's a type of value which can be converted to a Boolean. Now, a Boolean, if you've not heard the term before, is exactly true or exactly false. There is no middle ground. It's either true or it's either false. Now, something that's Truthy looks like it could be true, but when evaluated to a Boolean, it definitely gives us the answer that is 100% true. Now, for example, in JavaScript, we have empty strings. Now, an empty string would completely evaluate to false. A string with some information inside, such as the word hello world, would in fact evaluate to true. So what I'm going to do is take this video and show you some interesting concepts and things that we haven't particularly learned about just yet. But the way that I've designed these videos is that you can come back to them and perhaps even take this course 2 or even 3 times and use it as a reference guide for your core JavaScript knowledge. This course is focusing on how the JavaScript language works and all the deep knowledge gaps that are missing from many other courses. So let's start off with our index.js file. Now, I've got my server running and I'm also going to hide this sidebar to give us a little bit more room. Now, if you want, you can add a comment here and we can just separate off our logic. We're going to keep this code above just to keep our page nice and styled. Now, what I've got on the right is also my console, so we can see things that change when we're evaluating new expressions momentarily. So the first thing that we want to understand with conditional logic, and we've already looked at this comparison operator. Now in JavaScript, we know from the previous chapter that we have a double equals and we also have a triple equals, and they do 2 very different things as we've just learned. So what we'll do is start off with just a quick console log, and we're going to be using console log quite extensively throughout this course to get you an understanding of the full JavaScript language. Now, what we'll first have a look at is the number 1. Now we can say equals equals number 1, and I'll go ahead and duplicate this and also give that one a triple equals. So when I save this out, we'll see something quite interesting. We'll see true and true. So these are values which are in fact given to us via a comparison. They're not strictly Truthy or Falsy themselves. They are comparing if one value equals another. We'll move on to Truthy and Falsy momentarily, but it's interesting to understand the difference between these two. So if we change this to a string with the number 1, we actually see true and true again. However, if we change this one to a string, we should see true and false. Now, as we learned in the previous chapter about comparison operators, when we use a string comparison, it's actually converting them both to a string. And this is sometimes called coercion. So this is one way that we can test whether something will give us that true result. And this is from a comparison. So it's slightly different than a Truthy and a Falsy value, but it's well worth showing in this group of videos. So with that in mind, that's one way that we can go ahead and get some kind of value that either gives us a true or a false. There's no middle ground here. It's either true or it is false. So let's look at another example. We'll move down slightly and we're going to just console log out a few items here. Now, there are a few ways in JavaScript which we can convert something to a Boolean, and as we know, true or false is in fact a Boolean. We could go ahead and use this Boolean keyword, and you can see here that my VS Code is being quite clever and giving us that we can pass in any value. And the Boolean object is then going to return us a type of Boolean. So if we passed in true, this would then give us back the word true. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that an empty string would give us back the value of false. So here you can see that we have the value of false. If we then start entering some information into the string, we then see the value of true. So it's interesting to see that a string with a length property, so if the string doesn't have any characters inside, such as this, it has no length, therefore it evaluates to false. Now, there is a slightly cleaner way and more readable way that we can convert a value to a Boolean, and I like to use this approach because it's nice and explicit as well. So what we're going to do is just have a look at some examples and just understand how JavaScript works and how it converts some of our built-in objects to either true or false. So you may have heard of this before. This is the negation operator. So typically we would do something like if it's not true, whereas we're actually saying this is a not. And sometimes you might hear this as being called the double bang. But for us, we just need to know that essentially it goes not and then not. So it inverts it to either true or false, and then it flips it back again so that we can read it. So I'll demonstrate this and we can see this one becomes false, and then we can add another exclamation and it flips it back to true. Now this is pretty much the exact same thing as doing this. So that's a good thing to note. What we'll do is leave both of these just so we can have them as a reference. So let's continue the journey and have a look at something called an object. Now we will be covering objects as we continue through this course. And what we're doing in this video is just giving you some information up front just to set the scene of how all of these different types of behaviors in JavaScript tend to act. So here you can see that an empty object does evaluate to true. What we'll also test is an empty array. So here we'll do double bang and save that out, and then we see true again. Let's move on to another example. And if you've used JavaScript dates before, you'll probably have done something like this. Now what we can actually do is save that out again, and here you can see that this also evaluates to true. We'll go ahead and create another example, and here we're going to say that we're going to have a string with the number 0 inside. So it's not technically a number, it's a string with the value of 0, and again if I remove this, we'll get given the value of false. Now it's interesting because the number 0 itself evaluates to false, but inside of a string, it then evaluates to true. So keep all of these in mind, and if you're fairly new to JavaScript and you're coming through this video and thinking this is quite confusing, in reality it is quite confusing because that is how JavaScript works. And JavaScript is a really, really big language, and it has lots of nuances that we want to understand. So by giving you this up front, it sets the scene and the expectation of what is going to happen as we progress through the course. So let's give another example. What we're going to do is just simply pass in a number of 42, and then we'll get given the value of true. Now that's interesting because the number 0, as I just mentioned, gives us the value of false. So any number above 0, such as 42, does evaluate to false. So you can start to think that if you're coming from a different language and you're checking something equals 0, then we might have some potential bugs that may develop if we don't understand these things up front. So let's go ahead and create another console log, and this time we're going to say -42. Now you can see that this also evaluates to true because it's a truthy value, and JavaScript has many more things built in. We can even try the number pi, -pi, and we can save those out. Now you can see all of these evaluate to true. So let's have a look at some definite falsy values, and while we're here actually, let's go ahead and add these as truthy values. Now these are just some of them. As we continue through the course, I'd highly recommend that you just try these out and start thinking about JavaScript. Oh, I wonder whether this is a truthy value. I wonder whether this is a falsy value. And this will really help develop your thinking skills when programming. So let's have a look at some falsy values in JavaScript. Now the first most obvious value is definitely going to be the Boolean value of false. So you can see here that we have this false value. So let's move on to another example. We also have the value of null. Now null is by design also a falsy value, and you can see in our console on line 25 that that is now evaluating to false as well. We also mentioned the value of undefined. Now undefined also evaluates to false. Now we've already mentioned this one, but we're going to just log out this number 0. That, of course, evaluates to false. We also have, and we'll come onto this in the next chapter when we start dealing with numbers, we have this NaN. So not a number is what this particular value stands for. So NaN is not a number, and that evaluates to a false as well. Another one which we have nicely covered is, in fact, the empty string, and you'll see again that this then evaluates to false. So you can see by passing different values, we get completely different results. So this is a very good resource and a very good lesson to start thinking about how our JavaScript is going to behave when we start programming in real applications. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to some real conditional logic in the next video and start talking about if, and else statements and how we can put them together to start thinking about our conditional logic in a more sensible way with our new Truthy and Falsy value knowledge.